You are now listening to the Someone's Favorite Productions podcast network.
All right, so welcome back to Wildside, the official Mondo Macabro podcast. I am extremely excited. We're going to have, as you all know, last time when we ended, we were talking about doing a Shinya Tsukamoto special because Mondo Macabro has two of Tsukamoto's films that they've released, in Gemini and Hiruko, the Goblin. And I can't believe we are lucky enough to actually have Tom Mess, who you all know is an author, a film writer, Japanese film historian. Tom is actually here joining us for the discussion. So Tom, thank you so much for making time for this.
Thank you too, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Of course. You know, I was just thinking, we're having a conversation in English. Your native language is Dutch, unless you, or I'm assuming so, and you're fluent in Japanese. How many languages do you actually speak at this point?
4 or 5.
That's amazing.
It depends. My spoken German is a bit, it's quite rusty.
Okay.
But I understand it entirely. So
that's amazing. That's amazing. I think I have a 7-year-old son, and I'd love to have him grow up in Europe for that reason of just being around other languages. It's such a, I don't know, we don't have that luxury in the US. It's much, you have to really make an intentional effort, you know?
Yeah. Foreign countries are always nearby if you grow up in Europe.
Exactly. Yeah. That's awesome. And so you have, speaking of foreign languages, I guess, and not a European country, but you've really made a focused effort in your career on Japanese cinema. And I'm just wondering, like, where did that kind of start from you? Like, how did you know that this was something that you were very passionate about?
That's really hard to say. It started quite early. I think when I was about 11 or so.
Oh, wow.
And seeing some of Kurosawa's films on TV and being really impressed with just that image of the samurai.
Yes.
And that's what really kicked it off. But I have no idea why that continued to fascinate me, because I'm from a fairly simple working class background and nobody had anything to do with foreign cultures whatsoever.
Okay.
I learned the culture halfway across the world. So I really can't explain why that fascinated me so much, but it continued to fascinate me. And so later I would watch, I'd go to the video store and rent other Kurosawa films, because aside from Kurosawa, there wasn't that much more. There was Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, which I also saw when I was about 13.
Sure.
And didn't really quite understand, but also was really fascinated by. And then when I was in high school, I started going to the Rotterdam Film Festival.
Oh, yes.
I was born and raised in Rotterdam, so it was nearby. But I started going when I was in high school. And Rotterdam has always been quite famous for showing Asian cinema.
Okay, yes.
There was lots of Japanese films, and we're talking now early 90s. So then I started seeing new Japanese films. So I started discovering like Takeshi Kitano and Shinya Tsukamoto and Takashi Ishii. And I was like, wow, today's Japanese films are really, really interesting too.
Yeah.
So it's just, one thing led to another, really.
I remember when I was in college, I was in university in from 2000 to 2005. And I saw Boiling Point. So you mentioned Takashi Kitano.
Yeah.
Takashi Kitano. I saw Boiling Point in the theater. I remember just thinking, like, holy hell, like, who is this guy? Like, this is amazing. And then, like Sonatine and Violent Cop and all these, just every single thing he has directed, it feels like is so much his own, like so much his own vision and so unique. It's just amazing to me.
Yeah, but with him, he had, like you say, it's really his own vision, kind of his own language of how to tell stories. And with Shinya Tsukamoto, you felt the same thing. It's like such a unique, personal style.
I say of course. I don't know if this is true for everybody, but for me, the obvious entry point for Tsukamoto is Tetsuo the Iron Man, and I saw that in university as well. This is one of those things that's kind of passed around as like, what the fuck is this kind of movie? When you're discovering cinema. And the first time I saw it, I mostly was just talking about this weird movie I saw with a drill penis. But it's amazing to see, as I've continued going down cinematic paths, from different countries. I love films from a lot of different regions and time periods and genres. I keep finding my way back to Tsukamoto in various ways. And I'm so happy to talk about him today with you because for that reason, I think he's somebody that if you only know him through Tetsuo the Iron Man, you're only getting 10% or 15% of this guy's personality and vision and skill, which we'll talk about with some of his later movies. But he's quite an amazing artist, actually. Just full stop.
Yeah, he's always been very independent.
Yes.
And he basically still works more or less the same way today as he did on Tetsuo. Of course, it's professionalized and he has his infrastructure set up pretty solidly. And of course, he has more money at his disposal, even though not that much.
Right.
But I think his philosophy and his approach to filmmaking haven't really changed all that much.
Yeah, and it shows in his work too. I think it's always very much his own. Like it feels there's never a movie I've seen from him where I'm like, well, I wonder if he was just a director for hire or something like that. Like they're all very much his.
Yeah, he's made a few movies for hire, and Gemini and Hiruko the Goblin are two of them, which is probably why people often tend to think they're sort of odd ones out in his career. But on the whole, every film he's made were his own idea, things he's developed himself over years often. And so every film that he's done is really a personal project.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And it's interesting to see because I think there's a beautiful set. Although this is the Mondo Macabro podcast, we can't really talk about physical media and Tsukamoto without at least mentioning that beautiful set from Arrow that they did because they put so much care into it, and quite a number of his movies as well. And you have a long some writing in that as well as commentaries. You did quite a lot of work in that set, right?
Yeah, that's true. They asked me at first to do commentaries on every single film in the set, which was essentially the entirety of give or take a few, the entirety of Tsukamoto's filmography.
Yeah.
So, and then I recorded them in chronological order as well. And so then I really got to talk about and really point out how things gradually evolve in his work from one film to the next. So that was a really rare opportunity. And like you say, the set itself was put together with so much care and it looks gorgeous. That's, I think, a real testament to what physical media can do and what I think the inherent qualities of physical media are compared to any other way that people watch movies these days. I don't think there's an either or between physical media and streaming because each of those platforms has their own qualities and their own their own characteristics that streaming is really useful to have. And physical media also has something that's really unique to physical media that you cannot replace with streaming, no matter what the majority of people say. And that Tsukamoto box set would be the ideal proof of that.
Yeah, I've always said if I was a dictator and could dictate physical media decisions, everything would be a director box set because it's such a treat to be able to go through a director's work in the way that they did with that set and just basically see so much of it. But his career, Tsukamoto's career is kind of broken up into a few different eras in my head, the way that I see it. And I think one interesting thing, if we look about Hiruko the Goblin, is pretty early on in his career. He was very much in this sort of steampunk phase of at least the product that he was making on his own. If you look at the adventures of Denshu Kozo and then Tetsuo and then Tetsuo 2. So I don't know, do you mind giving a little bit of light on that? Like how did Hiruko come up? I know you talk about it in the commentary, but for those that maybe don't have a chance to haven't seen it yet, how did this project come up for him?
So Hiruko the Goblin was the first time that he was commissioned to direct. The first time he was a director for hire. And he was basically unknown at the time. He had just won an award at the Pia Film Festival, which is a major festival in Japan for discovering new filmmaking talent, which has been going since the late 1970s. And so unknowns around the country send in their homemade amateur movie And then there's a selection that goes into the competition, and one of them wins the grand prize. And the grand prize comes with part of the budget for a next film. And so he was setting up a next film, but he won the prize not for Tetsuo, but for the one you mentioned, The Adventure of Denchu Kozo, which is the 45-minute film that he shot on 8mm film.
And it's sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but it's an interesting short if you have a chance to see it, because it has that electric pole coming out. It's essentially like a science fiction movie, sort of, right? Like a time traveling vampires.
Yes, that's correct. Yes, it's like a time traveling science fiction vampire battling kids adventure movie.
Yes, that's right.
And so he sent that into the Pia Film Festival and got the grand prize. But by the time that happened, he had already finished Tetsuo. And so he was already shopping around Tetsuo. So when he got the grand prize and the prize money, he started developing a next project, which was going to be an adaptation of a kid's, not really a novel, like a children's picture book about a boy who can see this giant monster bird.
Okay.
And somehow he was not able to get that off the ground properly. There was like several investors in that project, aside from the Pia Film Festival, and they couldn't really agree on stuff. And so Tetsuo was sort of done and lying around. And Tetsuo really just more or less broke Tsukamoto in several ways. I mean, he used up all his money, and all his crew ran away during the making of the film. And his parents threw him out of the house. So he said he was renting this really tiny, tiny room with walls so thin that he could hear the neighbors fart. And so he was in a pretty rotten position. But then, he got that award, and that was great. And then suddenly he got this offer to make Hiruko the Goblin. And so he just said, okay, I'm going to take it.
Right.
Yeah, so, and he was already thinking, I think he was just releasing or doing the first couple of screenings of Tetsuo. And he already had the Tetsuo 2, idea for Tetsuo 2 in his mind, and he was going around the screenings with this sort of survey. And he asked people to watch the film to fill out the survey. And the survey included the question: if I make another film, do you want to be on the crew? And in doing so, he already gathered some people around him, because he lost all his crew on the first Tetsuo.
Right.
And these were just complete amateurs and newcomers who were driven by their enthusiasm for seeing Tetsuo the Iron Man.
That's amazing.
And so he took some of those people with him when he started making this professional project, Hiruko the Goblin, which otherwise was made with this very experienced professional crew of filmmakers and this professional film crew. And so it was really sort of like an odd set of circumstances that led to him doing this all of a sudden. And of course, now we watch the film and we retroactively put it within the context of Tsukamoto's filmography, and certainly because it's between the two Tetsuos.
Right.
And it suddenly looks like such a completely different film.
Yeah.
But at the time, it was he just made his first film, and he got an opportunity to make a second film, which was a completely professional project with money. And so, why would he say no? So at the time, it didn't seem so strange, I would say.
I like the way you phrased that. That's right. Because for him, he didn't know about his whole career yet. It was just a chance to go make a movie.
Exactly.
Yeah, there's two things in what you said that I think is interesting. One is one of my personal favorite things about him as a director and kind of as a human, I guess, is this DIY spirit. Like, he's so dogged about it. He won't let it go.
Yeah, like I said, he's still making films essentially the same way he did when he was doing Tetsuo the Iron Man. It's still his project, and he comes up with the idea, and he writes the screenplay, and he does all the pre-production, and of course he directs, and then he edits, and he does all the promotion himself. So he's on that from the very beginning to the very end.
There's an amazing quote from one of the actors in Gemini when they were in Venice, where he says, I'm gonna get the quote wrong, maybe you'll remember it, but it's something like he's an angel on the storyboard and a devil in the shoot or something like that. But like he's a very meticulous person on set. And so
Yeah,
there's not a lot of room for like he has a very specific vision, I guess, on set, and so it's difficult to work with him. But if you step back and look at his ideas, they're beautiful. So people keep doing it.
yeah. I think the fact that he always keeps working with people that really want to work with him.
Mm.
Well, on the one hand, it's very practical because these are mostly newcomers and they will work for little to no money.
Uh-huh.
But it's also because he has, like you say, this vision that he wants to see through.
Yeah.
And I've been to his film sets and I've seen him work, and indeed he can be very intense on
Okay.
set. He can be, not all the time, but he's very, very focused. Yeah, that's true.
But there is a lot of precision in his work, so it makes sense. There's not a lot of waste in his pictures. Going back to Hiroku for a second, the other point I wanted to kind of bring up, I guess, from what you initially were talking about was, I think Hiroku is interesting because people say it might be a little bit of an odd film in his filmography, but in some ways, not really. If you kind of look at it, it still has a ton of creativity in it. And these little spider monsters with human heads that are kind of ghost heads, they're still nightmarish. It's not, you can't fully escape from his nightmares, no matter, even if it's in a family film.
Yeah, it's true, but it also depends on what you look at. I mean, if you purely define Tsukamoto as cyberpunk and shaky cameras and lots of rapid editing, then yeah, you're not going to find that in Hiruko. But when we were talking about Adventure of Denchikozo earlier, I mean, I described it as a kid's adventure movie. Hiruko the Goblin was also very much a kid's adventure movie.
Yeah.
It's high school boy is on his summer vacation with nothing to do and sort of like falls into this weird adventure.
Yeah, exactly.
So in that sense, it's really not that unusual. And Tsukamoto, in fact, said to me about this whole issue that if you look at everything he had made up to and including Hiruko the Goblin, so it includes some of his earlier like 8mm stuff that he was doing as a high school student. A lot of those are like, boys' adventure stories.
Okay.
So up until and including Hiruko, Tetsuo is the odd one out, not Hiruko.
I like that actually. I'm going to quickly detour and talk about Takashi Miike, but I'll come right back to Tsukamoto. A lot of people just say Miyake's a horror director because they think of Audition maybe or something, right? Mm-hmm. But if you spend time with his movies, he's actually quite funny. I think his movies, a lot of them are quite optimistic, actually. Like, they're actually quite lighthearted, even though this content can sometimes be for adults, no question. But the spirit in the movie is light. Like, I think about even a movie like Rainy Dog, which is dark for so long and difficult to watch for so long. But at the end, it's like this kind of family that wouldn't find each other any other way. And they form this kind of beautiful bond, and it's sweet. It's very sweet. And I think Miike is understood in that way as a director, is he's somebody who actually brings a lot of lightness into his movies. And I think in the same way, Tsukamoto brings a lot more than he gets credit for from a human perspective. Like, I think he actually writes, he's comfortable with chaos, I think, and he's comfortable with like kind of maybe borderline more surrealistic art. But there's a strong human connection in all of his movies that I think roots them and makes them rewatchable and kind of adds another layer to them that I really love.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, if we say that there are different phases to his career, then I think those different phases have also brought out this human aspect to different degrees.
Yes.
And again, if you just want to peg Tsukamoto as the cyberpunk guy with the rapid fire editing and the shaky camera, then you're not going to be looking at this per se. But stuff like Snake of June or Vital, and then of course the more recent films which have become very strongly anti-war. That aspect of him has come out quite forcefully, I would say.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I wouldn't say that Hiruko is a film that has a lot of political message or a societal message. I do think in some ways it's a more straightforward narrative. Like you said, it's an adventure film. And I do think it's plays. I don't necessarily think there's layers on every rewatch like there might be with some of the Tetsuo films or Tokyo Fist or something like that. I think it's, to me, Hiruko is pretty straightforward as far as the story goes. One thing I really like about it, though, as the movie's kind of playing along, is the first time you see so one of the main characters is this boy on summer vacation, like you said, and you see this face appear on his back, and you're kind of curious where the story is going to go. And I think as the movie progresses, he starts to have more faces appear on his back. I'm trying to think of what to say without giving away spoilers, but I'll just say, like, as it goes on, I think one similar to maybe like a Spielberg or similar to maybe some more Hollywood directors, you always feel comfortable that they have control of where the story's going, and you don't have to worry about, am I going to find this out later on, or is this story going to get kind of wrapped up? Like in that film, he's not trying to leave with ambiguity. I think he's trying to kind of keep it clean and wrapped up. And so it's quite easy to relax with the movie, even though it has some scarier images in it, but it's quite easy to relax and just enjoy the ride, I think, as well.
Yeah, that's true. I think that's something he really wanted to. That's the kind of film he wanted to make. I would imagine that, he wanted to make this really enjoyable thrill ride of a movie that could reach a large audience. I think reaching a large audience has always remained a goal of his, but perhaps not enough to want to compromise his style all that much. Occasionally, there's been a film where he'd sort of like try to compromise a bit in order to find perhaps a bigger audience, but on the whole, he wants to do it on his own terms. And I think with Hiruko, that really came together very nicely, because it was just in the nature of the project to be this sort of like appealing, entertaining roller coaster ride movie. Ironically enough, it wasn't very successful, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's too bad. I don't know, maybe it was marketing. You hear sometimes it's just sometimes studios have a difficult time understanding how to market the picture. Has he had any thoughts as to why it wasn't successful, looking back on it?
Yeah, he says it had to do with the marketing, and normally he does all the marketing himself. And in this case, it was the Shochiku studio that, the regular marketing department that did the marketing. He felt it wasn't very strong, and I didn't really focus enough on certain appeal points, on certain points that could reach certain audiences.
Yeah.
And so that sort of strengthened his resolve to continue to work on the marketing of his later films as well.
It's an interesting, if you're such a talented artist and business person and executive, that you can kind of make these decisions better than the studios. That's quite a unique gift. One other thing, you did mention that he likes to do his own camera work a lot of times, but it's maybe worth mentioning on Hiruko, it was actually a very talented cinematographer, Masahiro Kishimoto, that did a lot of Godzilla movies. And I'm sure, I guess as far as I know, he was mostly just like a studio filmographer, but he was involved in some Godzilla films. And I think that there is a nice maturity. No, maturity is the wrong word. But there is a more, the film looks very different, and the film looks a little bit more maybe aesthetically polished than some of the other films as well.
Yeah, a lot of the crew members were seasoned veterans, and not just the cinematographer, but I think a number of other people had worked on Toho monster movies and special effects movies, which, of course, with Tsukamoto being such a big fan of those films,
that's right.
It was kind of a dream come true to work with those people. And so, yeah, true. They really that really decides the look of that film, and it definitely looks like a polished film shot by seasoned veterans.
Yeah,
of special effects entertainment movies.
That was one thing that I think was very sweet in the interview he gave on the disc, was when he talks about his love for monster films. Like it feels very authentic.
Absolutely, yeah. Those films really shaped him into the filmmaker he would become.
Yeah, there's a little bit. I don't think they're similar in styles, but Guillermo del Toro talks about monsters in a similar way, where he really sympathizes with the monster, and I see that in a lot of Tsukamoto's work as well.
Yeah, I think Tsukamoto growing up just sort of like not just sympathized with, but just identified really with the monster on screen. Especially in the good monster movies, the monster is always a slightly sad figure.
That's right.
Because he's sort of like, Godzilla lumbers around because that's all he can do.
Yeah.
Lumber around because he wants to destroy stuff. It's just because it happens to be really big and it happens to be a city in there.
That's right. That's right.
The same thing with King Kong, and the same thing with Frankenstein's creature.
Exactly.
They just kind of lumber around, and human beings put them in situations where they're going to cause damage.
Yeah, the Frankenstein novel comes to mind because there's that sweet moment where he's trying to be gentle and he winds up hurting somebody. So it's like a very sad moment, right?
Yeah. So I think for that side of monster movies really have an appeal to people who sort of feel themselves kind of like a little bit outcast or don't really feel at home in their environment. And I think Tsukamoto was a case where that was really true. And I think with someone like Del Toro probably also, and certainly feels that way from watching his films.
If after Hiruko, before Gemini, so Hiruko was made in 91 and then Gemini came out in 99. So he had about 8-year period. He was quite busy in that period. He had Tetsuo 2, Tokyo Fist, and Bullet Ballet, which it's only 3 or 4 films, but if you think about it in terms of finding financing and everything that he does for the films, he must have been quite busy in those years.
It really went from one film to the next. Yes, that's true.
And his reputation grew with each film as well.
Yes,
correct?
Yes, that's true. Because with Tokyo Fist in particular, really sort of made people sit up and was like, okay, he can be Shinya Tsukamoto and have all those Shinya Tsukamoto qualities in a movie that isn't strange science fiction.
Right.
That is actually about human beings. And there's, a lot of people have found a strong feminist message in that film as well. So it made people notice him that maybe previously would have dismissed him because of the science fiction element. And so that really established him critically even more strongly than the Tetsuo films they had done. Yes.
We were talking a little bit about his internal drive and how focused he is on set. I think in order for somebody to write Tokyo Fist, you would have to be that personality because there's so much drive in that character, and so much that character is it's not written from a place of cliche. He's written from a very raw drive, and I think it feels, in my watching it feels like an insight into the Tsukamoto's mind in a way for me. I don't know if he's ever said anything about that, but I feel like I'm like, oh wow, this guy's very driven.
Yeah, I guess you're right. If you look at it in that way, yes. But his characters tend to be, especially the characters that he plays in his films. Because I think in Bullet Ballet is the same thing.
That's true.
Like obsessed person. In that case, it's trauma because his wife committed suicide. But with Bullet Ballet also, there's this guy who just will not stop until he gets what he wants, even if he gets beaten down time and time again.
That's true. That's true. That movie really goes in some wild directions because he is essentially. I'm gonna make the plot seem overly simplistic, but in his look for a gun, he essentially gets involved in mafia activity, right? And gets further and further down into it. And but like you said, he's relentless on his quest, and he gets himself into a lot of bad situations. And then after that, I don't want to say seemingly out of nowhere, but there's quite a big jump in tone, aesthetics, story, going from Bullet Ballet to Gemini. It's quite a departure.
Yeah, that's true. But Gemini was sort of the next film that he was commissioned to do. And it was the same company as Hiruko the Goblin that brought it to him, which is a company called Sedic International, which also worked with Takashi Miike a good number of times.
Okay.
And including stuff like 13 Assassins, but also Brick People in China. And so there was already a bond there. And plus it was an offer to adapt the stories of Edogawa Rampo who was Japan's greatest writer of sort of like mystery stories and kind of horror stories, and with the style that people call erotic grotesque.
Yes.
And Tsukamoto has always been a big fan of that writer.
The Taro Ishii was very famous.
Taro Ishii is also famous for adapting a lot of his work, like Horror of Malformed Men, etc., which actually adapts some of the same material as Gemini. So it was another one of those occasions where the conditions made it difficult to say no.
Yeah.
And it was supposed to be, I think, originally like a 45-minute to 1 hour film, like a mini feature. At the time, that was there was kind of a market for that, because this is when like someone like Gaspar Noé was coming out with his first sort of like medium length feature, and was doing quite well internationally. And so that was the original intention, but it just sort of like blew up a bit, and the whole project became bigger than he expected, and took more time than he expected, and more energy and everything. But yeah, it was an occasion for him to really go into that Edogawa Rampo world, which has a very specific aesthetic.
Yes.
And it's the aesthetic that Gemini has. It's very kind of colorful, but slightly twisted, and just below the surface of the color, there's sort of like this decay and sickness that always hides. There's this kind of like twisted sexuality that runs throughout everything. So this is sort of like, as I said before, the erotic grotesque, as it's described.
That's such a succinct and beautiful way to describe that whole movement. You're exactly right. You can see, especially in Gemini, I just recently did a whole episode on Taro Ishii, so these movies are fresh in my mind. But if we focus on, I guess, Gemini, the eyes is where you see a lot of the decay, and the teeth, especially those two. Both in the performances and in makeup, I think you see a lot of. They look like almost like not ghosts, but on the way to becoming a ghost or something. A lot with the makeup.
Yeah, true. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, of course, there's this. He creates this contrast between the rich and the poor, and then he has the rich being really staid and ceremonial in their interaction with each other, but then the poor have this sort of like carnivalesque sort of like, they move around in unexpected ways, but at the same time, with that sort of like celebration of life that they have, is always underneath, is always lurking the danger of dying, of disease, etc. And I think that's expressed in what you mentioned, the makeup of the eyes and the teeth, and slightly, the odd looking skin.
Yeah, I think that when you talk about the difference between poor and wealthy in Gemini is very strong. Kurosawa was praised for High and Low for a similar discussion. And this film is nothing like High and Low. I mean, they're not the same movie by any means in story or anything. But I do think there is an equivalent distinction, and you immediately know in the film visually, and the way that the characters are acting, and everything is completely shifted when they go back and forth. And it does play quite an important role in the story itself.
Yeah, that's true. Of course, Tsukamoto is a big fan of Kurosawa. That's one thing, and I think the general theme and the divide is indeed very similar between Gemini and High and Low.
Yeah,
but yeah, well, I don't think it's a strange. I don't think it's a very strange comparison at all. It makes sense to compare Gemini to High and Low.
And I think I'm always selfishly, maybe, I don't know if selfishly is the right word, but I'm always trying to make an effort to compare Tsukamoto to Kurosawa or Orson Welles if I can, or any director that is on the Criterion Channel and gets this kind of pass at being an art house favorite, because I do think in general a lot of genre directors don't get that same level of respect, and I don't think that's fair, because you have people like Tsukamoto. The amount of artistry that goes into his stuff, it could easily be playing in MoMA and nobody would ever question it. And I think I just want to make sure people hear, get to hear that.
In a way, Tsukamoto isn't a genre director. I mean, you can call someone a genre director because his films, he makes science fiction, or cyberpunk, or whatever you want to call it. So that's a genre, and therefore he's a genre director. That's one way of looking at it. But if you look at genre filmmaking, usually there was someone, a director who worked for a major studio who made films in the genre that were typical for that studio. That's true in Japan, and that would also certainly be true for Kurosawa, for example, because period action films were a genre, a major genre. But it's also true for like MGM musicals in the 1930s and 40s or something.
Yeah, that's true.
And so Tsukamoto was never part of that kind of infrastructure, and he doesn't make genre films because he is told to do so by his employer. And again, if you look at the various phases of his career or the evolution of his career, then he's tried his hand at all sorts of types of stories and characters and genres. So it's hard to label him a genre director, I would say, from that perspective.
No, that's a good point, and I'm glad you're saying that, because I think, especially after Gemini, let me start there, and you can correct me if you think I'm wrong, but if you look at something like Snake of June, that's a beautiful love story, very erotic story. I mean, it's, you would never, if you were to see Tetsuo the Iron Man, you would never expect to see a movie like that. So I think it is important for people to see more of his films and kind of get a more broader perspective on who he is as an artist. And so I'm glad you actually corrected me on that. I think you're right. It's not fair to call him a genre director. His talent is not only independent and not only his own visions, but it's also very high and kind of at the highest level of artistry.
Yeah, and also it depends on how something is received and positioned over the years. Kurosawa was a genre director. I would say actually Kurosawa was more of a genre director than Shinya Tsukamoto.
That's true.
And but he made a movie called Rashomon, which is kind of an odd one out as the kind of genres that he made, and then somehow it ended up showing at a foreign film festival in Venice in 1951, where people considered it an artistic film, and it won the grand prize. And then it went to America and it won the Oscar as well. And so, but this is happening at a time when world politics are changing radically, from World War II, in which Japan was the enemy, to the Cold War, in which Japan is being sort of like set up and groomed to be the new ally in Asia. And the Americans need to change the international image of Japan away from that idea of the former enemy. And they used this aspect of traditional aesthetics, like the Zen gardens and the flower arrangements, and the samurai films sort of fit into that. So it all depends on the context, what kind of world this film emerges from. And that's how Kurosawa was positioned as a great artist who made films that expressed traditional Japanese aesthetics, right? With the samurai movies especially.
Yeah.
And so Kurosawa was intentionally positioned as a creator of great art, great Japanese art. And so that was not the case with Tsukamoto when he came out. It was with this movie that completely fit into what was going on at the time in terms of cyberpunk and body horror. Yeah, just before that, we had, of course, Akira, the Katsuhiro Otomo's superb masterpiece anime. But we also had, we just had the Terminator and RoboCop, and we had the work of Clive Barker, and of course Cronenberg was always referred to whenever someone was talking about Tsukamoto. So it really depends on the context in which this movie sort of like lands suddenly. And in both the cases of Kurosawa and of Tsukamoto, that's been sort of like defining their image for the rest of their careers, essentially.
I don't know. I hadn't really thought of it that way before. I really like that because it's true when you talk about Tsukamoto. People, I mean, I started the podcast this way. I guess people have a hard time getting over the fact that he's done more than Tetsuo the Iron Man, or they just haven't seen it. And so that's another reason why I'm so happy that Mondo Macabro put these two out. I think it does show a different side of him, especially if that's your only experience. And both movies, I think, are quite accessible. So it's like it's easy film, maybe like a more broad audience can watch the film. You don't have to be, Tetsuo can be a little bit somewhat limiting and kind of who can enjoy it, I think. But they also play a lot with imagination. I think some of the imagery in Gemini is choreographed in such a way that it's quite haunting. Like there's two images that stand out to me. One is, there's the one on the cover where there's a woman who basically has her back turned and she's holding a man's head in a way that it looks like it's removed from his body. But that image is duplicated throughout the film and quite a lot of times. So there's every time they sleep at night, they pull their blankets all the way up to where there's only their head showing. And so there's actually quite a lot of visual imagery throughout the film where it's only heads. And it kind of creates practical effects because there's no special effects, but just practical effects of this sort of horror that's lying underneath that I think is quite well made.
Yeah, good point. That's a very interesting observation about the motif, the visual motif of the heads.
Yeah.
There's definitely a visual motif of the heads in Hiruko the Goblin too.
Yes, that's the thing with heads. Yeah, but I don't know what else there is to necessarily say about these two films. I think for me, I've seen them all before, but revisiting Gemini, I was struck by this time by how beautiful of a film it actually is visually. It's quite striking. The whole thing.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's also a film that had all the key crew members were these really hugely respected veterans, the costume designer and the makeup artist and the cinematographer, and on and on and on. So he really got to work with a kind of a dream team on that one.
It does make me wonder if he wasn't so fiercely independent, just sort of what other projects he would say yes to.
That's a good question. I mean, he does occasionally. I mean, he was at some point attached to doing the third adaptation of the third Ring novel, Loop,
okay,
which was never made, as far as I'm aware. And so they initially went to him for that one. And that's one of those cases where it also depends, like on the mood of the person, really.
Yeah.
Tsukamoto, as a film lover, he really loves many different types of films. And so I would imagine that inside him there's always the desire to try out the different kinds of films that he loves, and to not be limited to being Shinya Tsukamoto all the time.
Well, the good news is he's still quite young as far as directors go. He still has a lot of years ahead of him. So is he's still gonna, I mean, as far as you know, he's still gonna continue making films as long as he can, right?
He's making a film now.
Yes.
I messaged from him a while ago, and he said, right now I'm making a big film. So that's all the information I have. So definitely there's more to look forward to.
Yeah, wow, that's great. Tom, thank you so much for coming on. Is there anything that I forgot to ask about these two movies that you would want to make sure people know about?
No, I think we covered pretty much all the bases as far as those two films are concerned.
Yeah. For the sake of anybody that's curious, is there a way, and maybe this is not a fair question, but is there a way that you would describe his career as it continues to evolve? Sort of, I guess the question for you is, who is he now to you as a director? Like, what is the way that you describe Tsukamoto with his whole career kind of in retrospect?
I would say that in a world and also a film world that is becoming increasingly radicalized and yet conformist. It's becoming increasingly sort of like, we're facing a world that's going to go through a lot of changes in the future.
Yes.
And I think a lot of people are reacting to that by holding on to as many of their old securities that they can. And even if those securities are an illusion. And I think Tsukamoto film is doing this as well. Yeah, things are getting more and more safe. We get more and more remakes. We get more and more new adaptations of material that originates in the late 20th century, whether it be comic books or as I said, movies or TV series that are getting remade. And I think within that whole situation that we're in, Tsukamoto is the kind of filmmaker that makes you want to, believe in the future, keep hope. He's one of those people like where you go like, oh, I'm really glad a person like this still exists in the world, and a filmmaker like this still exists in the world, because there's not that many, and that's to me more than the coolness of the cyberpunk and the old style, or the interest, the tourist interest in this filmmaker that sort of evolves very, very gradually. Right now, I think that's to me the greatest aspect of Tsukamoto that keeps me fascinated.
I love that. What a beautiful way to end. Actually, before we go, Tom, there is one thing I wanted to ask you about, and shame on me for not bringing this up earlier. But you have a very unique connection to Mondo Macabro in addition to Tsukamoto. It goes quite far beyond just him as a director, right?
Yes, that's true. Mondo Macabro, when it was not yet a label, before that it was a book written by the head of Mondo Macabro, Pete Toombs. And so that's a book that came out in the late 1990s. And that's a book that I owned and I bought right after it came out. And so I'd say in 98, 99, sort of. And Pete's approach to writing about films from other countries and other cultures really was a big inspiration on myself and Jasper Sharp for starting Midnight Eye, which is, of course, the website that he and I and my brother Martin started in 2000. Specializing in Japanese cinema. And we wanted to write about Japanese films that we were seeing that we loved and that nobody seemed to be writing about. And so, okay, that's great. And we set up this website, and then between Jasper and myself, we did most of the writing. We were talking about, okay, how are we going to write about these films? What approach do you take? Because at the time, people were there was either the sort of like the academic approach to Japanese cinema, or there was this sort of like extremely fanish style of writing, which kind of we felt kind of was a bit disrespectful towards the actual films that people were writing about.
Okay.
It was kind of the fashionable to look down on the films that you were writing about and to make fun of them. And that's something that we didn't want to do. We thought that was too simple. And we said, if we're going to write about films from another culture, and we love these films and we want people to see these films, then we also want people to sort of have a sense of where these films come from. And so, as much as we were able to, we wanted to put the films in their proper context.
I love that.
And this is something that Pete did very, very well when he wrote Mondo Macabro. This is, as far as I can tell, that was his whole point for writing the book. Saying these films are amazing because, and if you know this and this about the country they came from and the time in which they were made, you're going to appreciate them even more.
Yeah.
And so there's sort of this thing like better, more enjoyment through better understanding.
But how do you, if you're a young writer who's interested in continuing down this path, how do you find that context, Tom?
Researching. research your topic, essentially. Don't. I'm a teacher now, and when I teach film and students write papers, I always try to tell them, don't rely too much on your own assumptions, because very often you don't know that they are assumptions. And by doing research, you sort of challenge your own assumptions. So you realize, oh, hold on a second, no, that's not true, right? That's not correct. It was like that. But then right in front of you is the information that says otherwise. And but doing research, I think is really, really fun. It's probably the most enjoyable part of the whole writing process.
And this research for you is mostly done through, like for example, let's say, because Pete Toombs, I know a lot of it was relationship driven. He's a very relationship driven person, and he would go talk to folks and just learn the history, kind of verbal history. So was that your style as well, or were you in libraries? Like, where are you? How are you doing this?
Both those things. I think there's a desk research aspect to it, but then there was also from quite early on with Midnight, basically from the beginning, even before we started Midnight Eye, we were already interviewing filmmakers. The first couple of, when we launched, already we had several interviews on there because we'd been interviewing filmmakers. We'd already interviewed Kinji Fukasaku, for example. We'd already interviewed Kiyoshi Kurosawa, for example.
Amazing.
And so that was always part of the whole mission, to get that perspective as well. So talking to the people and learning to understand the films better through talking to the people that actually made them. So it's a bit of both. You do the field work, but you also do the desk research.
Well, that reminds me of a question I should have asked as well. But if you're going to point people to one place where they can support you now, is Midnight Eye the best place to go now? Where do you want people to be?
Midnight Eye retired 15 years ago. And 10 years ago. So, 2015. So that's not. It's still up. I mean, it's an old HTML based website.
Yeah, I found, because I was going to say I was reading through it before, but you're just saying it hasn't been updated in a while. I understand.
Yeah. So, but it's still there. So, of course, I have a social media presence. That's one thing. That's if there's news about stuff that I've been writing that's coming out, that's the place to find it. But there's been a lot of upheavals in the social media world as well. So where to stay and where to go from here on in is still somewhat vague. I went to this other place, this Blue Sky, that people would be going like, oh yeah, that's so wonderful. But then as soon as I went there, it turned out to be sort of like a liberal echo chamber rather than a rightist echo chamber. So I was going like, what's the difference?
Yes.
So I'm not really sure what the base is going to be, or what the base will remain from now on. And of course, it's you have to buy the book, buy the books that come out. My most recent one was a Japanese film and the challenge of video, which was about the Japanese straight-to-video world, V-cinema.
Oh, that's great.
And that's now sort of like having an effect because Arrow is putting out a V-cinema box set that I worked with quite extensively. And I hear one or two other companies are also dipping their toes into the same waters. So, basically, just, buy the product you love and you're interested in. And that inevitably is going to benefit me as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for making time for this today, Tom. It's been really a pleasure to meet you and to speak with you.
Thank you. You too.
All right. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. To hear more shows from the Someone's Favorite Productions podcast network, please select the link in the description